Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's final webinar in this series called Montana's Native People Perspectives on the Clovis Child, hosted by the Yellowstone Gateway Museum. My name is Diane Chalfant, and I'm a volunteer and board member of the Yellowstone Gateway Museum here in Livingston, Montana. The Clovis Child refers to the 12,600-year-old Anzick Site in Park County, Montana, the oldest known burial site in North America. Since it was first discovered in the 1960s, the site and the remains of the child buried there have been the focus of cultural and scientific study. In a moment, I'll introduce the museum's curator, Karen Reinhardt, but first, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so that you'll know how to participate in today's event. At any time during the webinar, you'll have the opportunity to submit your questions to our presenters. Your questions will be anonymous, and to submit a question, just type your question in the Q&A at the bottom of the control panel, and Karen and I will read the questions and share them with our speakers. We do have many participants today, and we'd like to be sure that we can track and answer any questions that you may have. So again, if you do have questions of our speaker, please use the Q&A tab. We will be recording the webinar and we'll upload it to Yellowstone Gateway Museum's YouTube channel after the event. And then finally, following the webinar, you'll have an opportunity to take a very short survey. We do hope that you'll take that survey because we'll use the results to help us to continue to improve the webinar series. Thank you. And now I'd like to introduce Karen Reinhardt.
Hello, everyone. Before we get started, I'd like to extend a special thanks to Sarah Anzick for envisioning this career-oriented webinar about a year ago. We are also very grateful to Humanities Montana for supporting this webinar series, and I'm very pleased to have the assistance of Diane Chalfant. Thank you so much, Diane. Tonight's program is particularly special as it brings together nearly all of our speakers from this series in a panel discussion format. We hope that college and high school students, particularly tribal college students, will consider careers in the fields related to our speakers' work. Our speakers will each provide a brief introduction and then field questions from the audience about their work and their various perspectives on the Clovis Child site. And perhaps they will have questions of each other as well. This should be a fascinating interdisciplinary discussion. Please don't be shy about posting questions in the Q&A. That is the purpose of this webinar, and we'd like to make this program especially meaningful for you. And now for the speaker introductions in alphabetical order. Crystal Alegria, historian, you're up.
Oh, thank you so much, Karen and Diane, and thank you to Humanities Montana for sponsoring this, and thank you, Sarah, for having the idea of doing this webinar series. It's been great. I've really enjoyed watching everybody's presentations over the last year. So like Karen said, my name is Crystal Alegria, and I am the director of the Extreme History Project, which is a nonprofit based in Bozeman, Montana. And our mission is to make history relevant. And so I have a background in history and archaeology. I have a bachelor's degree in anthropology, and I have a master's degree in history. And so that kind of sets me in this work. And my connection to the Anzick Site really goes back pretty far. I grew up in Livingston, Montana, about 30 or 40 minutes from where the Anzick Site is located. And I had heard a little bit about this site growing up. I was always interested in archaeology, so I heard little bits and pieces about the Anzick Site, but I didn't really understand how significant this archaeological discovery was until I started in my freshman year in anthropology, taking Anthropology 101. And that's when I really learned more about this burial site and why it was so significant to understanding our human past. And after learning about this really important place, I kept coming back to the Anzick Site and trying to promote this important archaeological site and the critical information that was learned from it whenever possible. I had a good chance to do this while working at an organization called Project Archaeology. We, in partnership with the Office of Public Instruction and Indian Education for All, published a curriculum for middle and high school students called Investigating First Peoples, the Clovis Child Burial. And I'll put a link to that curriculum in the chat here when I'm done with my introduction. But doing history in this place that we now call Montana, it's important for all of us at Extreme History and in all the work that I've done to always bring this history back to that 12,500 or 600 year mark and talk about the people who came before us and the people who lived in this place that we now call home. For Extreme History, most of our walking tours start with the Anzick Site. Even if we're talking about downtown Bozeman, we bring it all the way back to that history of the Anzick Site because it's so important to let people know who came before and who inhabited these lands through deep time. So we always like to talk about the importance of this place. And actually, we talk about it pretty frequently in the work that I do. With Extreme History. We just did a podcast with Shane Doyle about a month ago that talked about the Anzick Site. So we talk about it pretty much all the time. I would say, you know, at least weekly, I'm talking to someone about the Anzick Site. So it still plays such an important role in the work that I do today. So
Great.
Thanks, Karen.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. Sarah Anzick, molecular biologist. You're number 2.
Great. Well, it's really exciting to be here again tonight with everyone. So I'm Sarah Anzick, and I have a connection to the Clovis Child and the Anzick Site due to the fact that the burial is located on my parents' property in Wilsaw, Montana. But I've also had an ongoing personal and professional connection with the ancient child. And that is, as a molecular biologist by training, I began my research career while working toward my bachelor's degree at Carroll College in Helena, Montana. And I had hoped to go to medical school or veterinary school, but discovered my passion for research when I landed a job as a summer intern at Los Alamos National Labs in New Mexico. And I recall being really excited about that, along with a little fear of leaving my family and home state to head south to New Mexico to start this really unknown journey in my life. But it was really that experience and the discovery of scientific research that essentially transformed my career aspirations and shaped who I am today. So during that time, I had the honor and privilege of assisting on the physical mapping efforts of the Human Genome Project at Los Alamos. And importantly, the internship led to my pursuit of a master's degree at the University of New Mexico and also provided the opportunity to travel to a scientific meeting in Colorado. And while I was there, I was recruited to the National Human Genome Research Institute at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland, where I studied cancer biology and earned a PhD in molecular and cellular oncology. And it was around this time when I began piecing together the impact of what we might be able to learn from the Clovis Child and my skill set as a molecular biologist. But at the time, I loved cancer research too, and I really felt privileged to be working at NIH, where we had access to state-of-the-art techniques that promised to someday help improve cancer diagnosis and treatments. And in fact, I co-discovered a gene that's involved in breast and ovarian cancers, and I named that gene amplified in breast cancer ABE1. In 2006, I moved to the National Cancer Institute and gained additional skills in cancer genomics and also in next generation sequencing, which was what was utilized for the Clovis Child remains. And in 2010, I was able to get back to my homeland of Montana, where I transitioned to the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, known as Rocky Mountain Labs here in Hamilton, Montana. And over the past decade, I've worked in a core facility where we collaborate with NIH investigators on studies of infectious diseases. So I've left the cancer field and I'm now in infectious diseases, including SARS-CoV-2. So it's hard to believe, but I've worked as a scientist for over 30 years. And I'm really excited to be back here tonight and hopefully encourage and stimulate some younger generation out there to consider pursuing careers in the sciences. So I look forward to an engaging conversation tonight.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, Jessica Bush, State Archaeologist, you're next.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Diane. Hello, everyone. My name is Jessica Bush. I'm the Montana State Archaeologist. I have both my bachelor's and master's in anthropology. Actually, not a native Montanan. I grew up in Minnesota and ended up doing a field school with Dr. Prentice through the University of Montana, and that really inspired the direction my career would take. And I ended up going to University of Montana to finish my master's thesis under her. So I've worked in cultural resource management for many years. So that involved a lot of doing survey work and writing reports, basically for federal and state agencies in terms of if they were going to build cell towers or do pipelines or fiber optics, that kind of stuff. And that really gave me a good background for not only what I learned in school educationally for archaeology, but how archaeology is applied kind of in the more every day-to-day real world. I love the academic stuff, but it's very different when it's applied in most people's professions. So I ended up working at the Montana SHPO. I started as the review and compliance officer. So my main position was reviewing Section 106 from the National Historic Preservation Act, reviewing those kind of projects, and worked my way up to state archaeologist when my predecessor retired. I have kind of a different relationship with Anzick in that I learned about it and it was influential, but it's actually had more of an impact on me in the last 2 years in ways that I didn't quite realize it would. Just being in the position I am, the interest and how people have a lot of questions about it. And so even though I wasn't there and a part of everything when it was happening, I feel like I've kind of got drawn in to this area and learning about the Anzick Child just from being in this position. And so that's been a really interesting journey because it's been coming in kind of from an outsider, like I'm sure a lot of people watching are, and really meeting the people and learning different things about what happened and what's going on and the impact that it's had on archaeology. And it's had a huge impact on archaeology. And I hope that's something that, if you guys have questions, or we can get into tonight a little bit talking about why it's so important. And I think because it's important on many different levels. So yeah, I guess that's my my background.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jessica. Okay, up next would be Dwayne Reed, Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. Dwayne?
Good evening. Thanks for having me here this evening. My name is Dwayne Reed. I'm an enrolled member of the Little Shell Tribe of Chippewa Indians of Montana, and I am also their Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. I have a bachelor's degree in Tribal Historic Preservation from Salish Kootenai College on the Flathead Indian Reservation in Montana, and I have a master's degree in anthropology from the University of Montana. I began to learn about the Clovis Child from the Anzick Site in Montana early on in my studies at Salish Kootenai College. And during the time, it was one of the more exciting cases that was in the news, along with the Kennewick human remains in Washington. So for my capstone, my capstone paper for my bachelor's degree, I did a research paper on the Anzick Site and the Clovis remains, and kind of a compare and contrast with the Kennewick men human remains. And I was able to learn how laws like the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act was being applied to these two cases. And I was also able to learn about the different types of sciences that were being applied to these cases. And I'd have to say my favorite thing and what I like to do most is STEM. So it was exciting to hear about, the DNA and the science that was being applied. And it was interesting to note, how different it was with the Kennewick Man, where there was a lot of physical anthropology applied to those remains that seemed to blur Kennewick Man's identity. And, what was so great about the Clovis Child was there were all sorts of different types of different theories about where Native Americans came from. And one of them was that our present Native Americans were recent migration into Americas that wiped out, like the mound builders and the Clovis people. And, so cases like the Kennewick Man, because they did physical anthropology, James Chatters rolled the head on a desk and then was, said he thought it was Caucasian. And it wasn't until they did an x-ray of the hip that they were able to see that there was a cascade point embedded in the hip. And that's what told him through typology that this was Native American. But that blurred, the identity of, who and what Native Americans were. And it was just so great once the findings came out from the Clovis Child, very, very old remains. I know, very sensitive, probably some of the only remains in America, that human remains that were associated with the Clovis culture. And that gave Native Americans our identity back, that was able to give us that identity. And the other thing that was amazing was those weren't the only remains found at the site. There was remains that I think belonged to another culture that were maybe about 1,000 years younger than the Clovis remains. And so it was just so amazing to see that the same burial site was used by people across such a large amount of time. And so for me, it was just a really great learning opportunity. I was able to learn how the law is applied. And then it was just really wonderful to see how, even though the Clovis Child remains were found on the Anzick family's private property, after the DNA testing was done, Sarah Anzick went ahead and consulted with tribes, and it ended up being a reburial. And so it was really amazing to see that, because with the Kennewick Man, there was it was the Army Corps engineers had the were supposed to take care of the remains, and then scientists sued in court so that they could study the remains. And it just really turned into quite an ordeal for the tribes. And it was just interesting to see how they played out. And as technology, science and technology get further and further, there's new things that we can learn from artifacts and cultural sites that are thousands of years old. And sometimes the laws gotta catch up to the science and technology. So it was really great to see that there's people out there that are willing to do the right things, regardless of present state of our legislations and our laws. So
Great. Thank you very much, Dwayne. Amanda Streeter-Trum, curator, you're up next.
Thanks, Karen. Hello, everyone. I am the curator of collections at the Montana Historical Society. I got my BA in anthropology and then a master's in museum studies. And I've been working at the Historical Society for about 13 years. And we at MHS physically care for and interpret the Anzick Site artifacts. Of course, the exception would be the child's remains, which were never at the Historical Society or displayed. So I had the privilege of curating what we're calling the End of the Last Ice Age exhibit, where the Anzick Site is interpreted and where the artifacts are displayed. So, of course, I had a lot of help with that project. I worked very closely with the state archaeologist, who at that time was Stan Wilmuth. I also learned from the work of others like Stocky White and in order to contextualize and present the site information accurately. And then, of course, the exhibit designers brought the whole thing to life. So it's always a team effort there. And now we're really excited because we're in the process of building a new building, which you may have heard about. It's going to be called the Montana Heritage Center. And so we're in the process of developing a new exhibit on the Ice Age and pre-contact period in Montana. And so that, of course, will feature the Anzick Site as well. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about generally what a curator does. So our job is to interpret or explain the meaning of things, which doesn't mean just laying out the facts. We need to provide context and information and stories. Otherwise, the exhibits would be kind of like walking through an antique store and you really wouldn't gain a lot of information that way. So we also have a dual purpose of preserving artifacts and providing access and information to them. So a lot of times those things are at odds with each other. So we have to figure out how to balance that and make sure that people are able to experience them. Otherwise, what's the point in having a museum and displaying artifacts at all? So yeah, I guess I just wanted to reiterate that my job is to learn and understand the work of others and then distill the information for the public. And so one of the things that we talk about a lot in creating exhibits is that we don't want to put a book on the wall. So we can't put Stocky's dissertation on the wall. So I have to read it and, learn about Sarah Anzick's work. And then, in order to kind of create this nice package and, present it to the public. So that's basically what I do.
Great. Thank you, Amanda. Okay, and Stockton White, anthropologist. Let's hear a little bit about you. You're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Karen. My name is Stocky White, and I have a degree, bachelor's degree in anthropology, a master's degree in cultural anthropology, and a PhD in applied anthropology. I currently work as an archaeologist for FEMA, and the work that I do for FEMA is essentially compliance work to make sure that anytime federal monies are spent on a disaster, that any cultural aspects, any archaeological aspects, anything to do with historic preservation, those things are taken into consideration and all of the laws are complied with. And so that's basically what I do as an archaeologist for FEMA. My work with the Anzick Site, I've known the Anzick family for many years, went to school with Sarah, and also Sarah's dad, Mel, was our ranch veterinarian for many years. And when my academic career came along, I got together with Dr. Larry Laren, who was a longtime PI on the Anzick Site, and he was kind enough to allow me to participate in researching the Anzick Site. So that got me academically together with the Anzicks and in working on the Anzick Site. In that work, academically, I did my MA thesis, which basically focused on the reburial of the remains and the legal aspects, as Dwayne had talked about earlier during his presentation, and how the laws applied to the reburial and things like that. My dissertation work on the Anzick Site actually focused more on questions that dealt with the artifact assemblage, the dating of the Anzick Site, and also some of the artifact processes in specifically making the bone rods. I think the Anzick Site presents itself as a really good opportunity and has in the past for people working together. I think the importance of the Anzick Site, one of the big important things is that we need to understand culturally our similarities and be empathetic to our differences as cultures and separate peoples. I think that, well, I'm honored to have been involved in the reburial of the remains. My wife, Lily, and I, Lily's also a PhD anthropologist. We were honored to have actually dug the burial hole for the reburial. And that day in 2014, it was just amazing. And we are so honored. We were allowed by the tribal authorities, by the tribes, the non-Native American people involved were allowed to participate. And it was a day I'll never forget. And so I think collaboration, if I were to have a word, one word that summed up the importance of the Anzick Site, it would be collaboration. And that's pretty much my background and my association with the site.
Great. Thank you so much. I believe that Dr. Shane Doyle will be joining us just a little bit later. So in that case, I think we'll get started on questions. Remember, audience, if you have questions, no matter how big or how small, please add them to the Q&A. Diane, would you like to read the first question?
Well, I guess I'd like to just kind of just back up and just remind everyone what a rare opportunity this is for all of you in the audience to have this group of professionals together for the next hour or so. So please, as Karen said, please think about what you've already heard, and also think as you listen over the next hour of things that spark your interest. And then finally, before we really get into this, the Yellowstone Gateway Museum will be doing an exhibit on the Anzick Site as well. And so we want to hear from all of you what the most important messages are, what are the things that you all would like to learn about most through the exhibits as well. So keep that in mind too, and you can use the Q&A to provide that. I guess I want to start with Jessica. You know, you had mentioned earlier about the impact of the Clovis Child site on the profession of archaeology, and I wonder if you want to talk about that a little more.
Yeah, definitely. I can talk about that. I think what's interesting about the Anzick Site and the Clovis Child is there's a lot of different facets to how it impacted archaeology. I mean, I can start with a little more the technical side in the sense that, yeah, it was one of the first times, or is the first time that we had human remains actually associated with Clovis artifacts. And we could show that definitively through the dating. It's also a site, even beyond that, where we've had camelops or camel remains at other sites before, but the Anzick Site is the first time that we could take proteins off of the stone tools and actually show that Clovis people were hunting the camels. So in terms of archaeology, it has all that kind of being a first and showing a lot of things that I think archaeologists suspected, but we didn't actually have definitive data for. I think the other side of it too, especially is, you know, we're a profession that studies people. And I think sometimes that gets forgotten. And, you know, for Clovis stuff, a lot of times what we were finding were caches and points, and, you know, finding stones is really great and it's really interesting, but it's hard to make that human connection. And I think there's something about this site and the Clovis Child that really touches people in the sense that we've all experienced loss at some point. And so you can kind of connect in the sense that these people lost someone that they cared for and, you know, put them in a special place. And so I think that brings a connection for a lot of people that maybe they hadn't considered before to the site. And I think we need to see a lot more of that in archaeology, that we're talking about not only people that once existed, but people that still have descendants that live today. So.
Great. Thank you.
One of the questions that we also received, or I received by email, relates to what you're saying. And this person said, how do you establish the 12,600-year-old dating? So if one of you, of the artifacts and of the boy himself. So maybe Sarah or could answer that?
Actually, I'm going to defer that to Stocky.
Okay.
That's great. I think the most important dating was done on the bone rods that were associated with the assemblage, and the particulars of that dating can be found in some of Mike Waters' papers, and the latest was a Bashara, I believe the last name was. On a reference. If I need to get the particulars on that, let me know. But the dating was based on the bone rods, and does that answer the question specifically? What exactly were they wondering? I'm sorry.
Well,
I didn't know.
The question was just, how do you establish the 12,600-year-old dating?
Oh, okay.
I think it's just a basic carbon dating question.
Carbon dating.
Why I defer to you.
Well, thanks, Sarah. Yes, carbon dating on the bone rods was the basis for the dating. That's correct.
We had just another question, an interesting question, and that is, the site was found on accident. Are there ways in which sites like this could be intentionally discovered that would be respectful to Indigenous people? Or can these types of burial sites only be found unintentionally?
Can I help with that?
Yeah.
I think the unintentional is just that. It was a happenstance, and I, as an archaeologist, certainly if someone finds something that might cue them into an archaeological site, it should be professionally excavated. That is the way to preserve, or I shouldn't say preserve, that is the way to document the context and the artifacts and just what the meaning of the site might be through the excavation of the site. But just digging into it can destroy so much so quickly. Archaeological excavation is a destructive process, but more so is a person digging into a site without documenting things you can have nothing for future reference. If you find something, it's best to get hold of someone who can take care of it and really honestly document things and do it right.
Crystal, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, thanks, Diane. I think that what Stocky said was completely correct, that if you do come across a burial, we do have burial laws in Montana, and Jessica could speak to that a little bit more than I could, but we have both federal and state laws that would come into play. So it's important, if you find a burial, to contact the person whose land you're on, whether that's state land, federal land, BLM land, Forest Service land, or the landowner. But even on private land, there are burial laws that will come into play. So it's important, if you do find a burial, to just leave it alone. And of course, as anthropologists, as archaeologists, we always try to do whatever we can to leave a burial intact. It's important to be respectful of the dead and leave those burials where they are.
Thank you.
And maybe Dwayne would like to chime in as well.
Please.
I would like to chime in. Part of my job is to be able to identify possible burial sites or areas that could have potential human remains. And so knowing about sites like this, studying to see, what types of things to look for. So when there is an undertaking, I can review the data and the information and be able to help make decisions to justify changing the route for something such as a pipeline or some fiber optic cables that are going to be dug. So yeah, knowing these things can be very, very helpful for the right people to, to make sure that there's not an inadvertent discovery. I know with my tribe, we have, our burial information is very sensitive and we don't like to share it, but we need to know it so that when we do have to consult on an undertaking, that these types of decisions can be made, because otherwise what will happen if, we do have an inadvertent discovery, you're going to have salvage archaeology and, potential damage to a site. So, oftentimes I know with us, some of our burial sites can easily be mistaken for geological features rather than cultural. So it's good to have experts that know how to identify these sites. So when they are found either inadvertently like this site, there's still a lot to know about it so that we can look for, these key indicators that we find. Like I said, the same place was used, twice in over a span of, I think, 1,000 years. So that tells you that this wasn't a spot that was chosen for just any reason. And so yeah, we strive to try to be able to identify these before any type of project has the chance to ruin them.
If I could, I'd like to follow up on, thank you, Dwayne, for those comments and follow up. So in Montana here, we have a burial board, and we have members of each nation in Montana on the board, also a forensic anthropologist, a member of the public. And so when there are inadvertent discoveries on private or state lands, then those cases come to the burial board, and we work to repatriate the remains as best we can. But it's also our preference 100% of the time that if the burial can stay where it was found, then that's what we want to happen, is to have it remain undisturbed.
Thank you, Jessica. I see that Shane Doyle has joined us. So Shane, welcome. I thought maybe you might want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about how you are connected to the Anzick Site and the Clovis Child.
Yeah, thank you. This has been a big deal in my life for me. Sorry I'm late. I'm actually helping to perform in a Native American Intermountain Opera production that's going to be happening tomorrow night and Saturday night here in Bozeman. And so I came on the Anzick scene, I guess, after the genetic sequencing had been done. And I think that my role initially was to act as a liaison between the research team and tribes in the state. And I think at the time, there was a lot of unknowns about how things were going to play out. We didn't, have any kind of firm estimation if the tribes would be supportive of a reburial, if they wanted to do a repatriation, or if they, had no interest in that at all. And so when I came on board in the fall of 2013, the paper was just getting ready to be published. It hadn't been published yet. And Sarah and Eska and the team wanted to make sure that they consulted with Native people before everything became officially published. And so, you know, I suggested to ESCA and the team that we take a little trip around the state and visit with as many tribal historic preservation officers as we could to, you know, share with them the news and, you know, kind of see what they wanted to do and ask them what they thought the next step should be. And, you know, I think we kind of had a real charmed tour, I felt like. Everyone was receptive to us. They respected the fact that we had come to them, you know, even though the study had been done, it hadn't been published yet. And I think that there was goodwill on the part of the folks we met because I think they understood that we were interested in, you know, making everyone feel good about the study, that what happened was worthwhile and that it was done in a respectful way. And I think in my mind, hoping that if we were able to achieve all that, that it would kind of be a real important step in future research, and that it would help open the door to more opportunities. And so, and I think it's kind of played out that way. Just in a nutshell, you know, we had a successful reburial, repatriation. Sarah was the one who decided, you know, she wanted to do that. And so I helped work with her and the tribes, the burial board, the representatives on the burial board to plan the reburial. And, you know, there were just a few bumps in the road, but overall it went pretty smoothly, I thought. And, you know, it happened. So I met ESCA and Sarah in September, and we had the reburial the next June. So, you know, less than a year later. And then, you know, the work has continued. I was hired on by the University of Copenhagen to do liaison and research work for them. And so I worked for them for a year and a half. And, you know, my charge was to introduce the topic of genetic sequencing to tribal communities and see what kind of reception that received. And, you know, with the goal in mind that communities would see the value in that research and that they would want to pursue that. And so, you know, I think what I found with working for them for a year and a half was that there was not a great interest on the tribe's part outside of the Blackfeet Nation, who kind of really way different from the other communities that we visited. You know, the leadership was interested, the people in the town in Browning were interested, they wanted to do it. And so, you know, just to bring us up current from 2013 to here we are 8 years later, I think we're on the cusp of doing a study in the Blackfeet community. I think we put all the pieces together now. Again, the community wants to see it happen. I think this past spell that we've had with COVID-19 has kind of reinforced the idea of the power of science and what we can achieve through research, especially in a modern day and age, and how quickly we can, you know, decode and sequence and identify proteins and so many other different things that used to take so long. Now we can do them, you know, overnight. And I just really am hoping and praying that now that things are starting to get back to some normalcy, at least here in America, that within the next year or so, we can pursue a sequencing study at the Blackfeet Nation. And that would include, you know, current DNA analysis as well as comparative of ancient DNA.
A question came in, and I think several of you might want to answer this from your perspectives, but the person was deeply honored and humbled to attend the reinterment and rededication in 2014. And they want to know, has the site been respected, and are there any concerns about the preservation of the site?
I was just there. Let's see, a couple weeks ago. There's a group in Park County called Leadership 49. And it's a class taught by MSU Extension. And so the extension agent in Park County invited me over to speak to the group, and they wanted to know more about the Anzick site. And so we met there at the cemetery outside of Wilsall. And there was about a dozen of them. And, you know, we walked over, we took a look, I showed them where the burial was, the grave site, and it seemed like it was all intact to me. I didn't notice anything out of line, or it didn't look like it had been disturbed or anything. And you know, we took a walk down to the creek, and I showed him where the original discovery had been made, and all that looked fine. So I think, you know, at least from my knowledge, from what I know and what I've seen lately, it seems to be in good shape, and I don't think there's any threat that I know of anyway outstanding on the property, but might be able to provide more insight.
I think that we've noticed removal of some stones, unfortunately. But when my parents are around, they try to rebuild it up. So anytime somebody's on there, but and I don't, obviously, just due to weather conditions, we no longer have the eagle feathers, and I miss that. So it would be really nice to have that readorned if possible at some point. But otherwise, I think it's been no problems.
There is another question about exhibits that I thought maybe Amanda could address. Our exhibits are still under development. So Amanda, here's a question. What is being presented in the exhibits in terms of the lithic technology of the Anzick Clovis cache, and how that informs us of the adaptations of these people? Stocky might have some answers there as well.
Sure, yeah, I'll need Stocky to help out a little bit. So, you know, at least in our exhibit, we started out by talking about the likely migration of peoples across using Beringia in some way to get to North America. And so we talk about that kind of migration, the tool types that were found along the Alaskan coast, and then the Anzick Site, and then subsequent tool technology after that. So we kind of, you know, just try to situate it in time. So I know that, you know, there are other discussions to be had about, you know, hunting and that kind of thing. So maybe Stocky can help out with that.
Sure. Some of the interesting aspects of the assemblage, one of them being, we had heard about the camel proteins that were found on one of the artifacts. And although we don't know really what that might imply, it does definitely tell us that or a small group of the artifacts from the assemblage were used, other than only making them for the burial. They had actually been used. And again, I have the fact is those were used, and then they are part of the assemblage for whatever that means. I don't know, but I thought that was a very interesting find. And also it allowed us to understand that camelidae were also part of the focus prey for these folks, as well as some rabbit. Additionally, some of the artifacts were telling of I believe the process to make, for instance, the bone rods, what I believe are foreshafts. There is a large concavity in one of the large, in actually the largest biface. found in the Anzick assemblage, as well as a couple of others on the margins that are essentially the same size as the margins of the bone rods. And I went into pretty extensive detail in my dissertation regarding that theoretical process of how the bone rods were made. Also, another thing that's important with that assemblage that we can kind of infer from the assemblage is the understanding of the landscape that many years ago, because of the potential for sourcing of the materials found in the assemblage. We have to, and also these tools were made of I consider them gem quality materials from very specific locations that would have been, people would have needed to know where to find them. So, and keeping in mind also, there were not horses, there were not ways, it was on foot. So the knowledge of the landscape speaks to the high level of knowledge of their environment that these people had as high technology foragers. And I go into that detail too, high technology foragers being a combination of hunter-gatherer characteristics, such as the collectors and forager basic concepts introduced by Louis Binford years ago. The high technology is more focused on artifacts and movement across the landscape, following game as opposed to more sedentary cultures. And not to go too far into that, but we can find a lot of information from the artifacts, and some of the materials we believe were a couple of 100 miles away from the site. So that tells you the extensive, that might suggest also cultural trade networks, or simply those people went and picked those materials up and were very mobile. So the materials can tell us a lot.
It is fascinating how much the materials can tell you, and the things that you know, like for instance, finding camel DNA on a point is a pretty direct connection. Other things you use the word, infer. And I guess the question, we're talking about something that happened 12,600 years ago, people who lived then. And with all that we do know, there are just knowledge gaps, about the site, the burial, the people, the flora and the fauna that were here then. And, this is a question for all of you, but if you could go back in time 12,600 years ago and get the answer to just one aspect of the site, what would you want to know?
Diane, I might, before I finish my ramble here, yeah. I might also say that the importance of one of the huge aspects, these materials that were found, the assemblage was when it was left with that boy, it was a huge contribution to him. Whatever the reason, he was a very important boy, and it was a very important thing. The reason all those beautiful tools and equipment were left with him, although I certainly don't know. It says to me that he was for whatever reason, he was an important, it was an important thing that it's like leaving your best gems with, those were the way those people survived. So very important. And I just wanted to say that. And if I had anything to learn, it would be probably on the spiritual level, and just where they came from locally and how they moved across the land and things like that would be amazing for me.
Anyone else want to offer up what you'd like to know most, if you could?
I'll jump in. I think there's so much I'd like to know about this place, but I think the thing I'm most curious about is the second individual that Dwayne spoke about earlier. I'd like to know more about that person. And we know a lot about well, I shouldn't say we know a lot, but we know some things about the child burial, but we don't know as much about that secondary burial. And if there were more burials in this place that we just don't have remnants of any longer. And I'd like to also know the meaning of this place, why this little boy was buried here. And then, 1,000, however many years later, a second individual was buried here, and maybe more individuals buried here. And as Shane always tells me, it didn't stop there, because he pointed out that right across the road from the Anzick site is a modern cemetery. So for some reason, this is a burial spot. And why is that? Why did people use this spot? What did this spot mean to the people who buried the Clovis child there, and why in that location, that second individual so many years later? So that's one thing that that I think about a lot.
Well, it's interesting too. I'll say I'm also curious about the nature of the burial, and Stocky had mentioned that this is possibly a very special burial, but the thing that's interesting is that this is the only Clovis culture burial that's ever been found. So we really have no idea, if this is a common thing, or if it was a common thing or not, or if, this particular child and this particular burial was special in some way, or if that kind of thing happened regularly with, different members of the society. So I'm really curious about that too. In addition to all the other things, like, the things that were lost, we've got the tools that were left behind, but things like clothing and, other cultural aspects, of course, are just really intriguing.
I've also had a curiosity on, could we potentially learn if this child suffered from maybe an infectious disease, or was it an accidental death? So I've always been, if I could travel back in time, just to kind of get a feel for how his family lived. Were they, as Stocky mentioned, were they mobile, or were they settled in that area? And then did he have siblings? How large was the family? And again, what did cause the death of this infant?
Something that I found that was interesting through my study is, way that artifacts are used and perceived by the public. And one thing I found, when people are looking at these real awesome, big, artifacts, Clovis points that could take down a mastodon, people, sometimes get this, vision of the brutish, thuggish people, heaving a giant spear at a, massive mastodon. But with the Anzick child, I think, Jessica touched on it, is it, gives you that different ideas, like, these were people that lost a baby, and that was powerful, emotionally powerful. And as Stockton has said, the best of their tools that they needed to survive were put with this. And so that gives real humanity back to these ancient people, that we're all not that far different. This was a most likely an extremely emotional experience for these the parents of this child. And when you see something like that, it gives the humanity back. It shows, like, yeah, these were people just like ourselves. And that's just one thing that I like to watch for when we do curation or study people, is that the right ideas about these cultures are given, because it can really affect the way that people perceive our contemporary Indigenous communities. It really these studies, these sites have a real impact on the way that people view our Indigenous people today. So that was one thing that, really stood out to me, was this was, an emotional event that happened to these people so long ago. And, it really gives the humanity back to, groups like that.
One of the members of our audience offered up a question. This person said, I would ask them, meaning the people then, how did you get here? Open up that door. It's interesting.
I think for me, I kind of echo a lot of the thoughts here, especially Crystal's. So many questions, what language did they speak? Is that language still around today? How many languages are they speaking? As far as passing Clovis technology, how did they do that? Because it was all across the continental USA. And it happened in short order. And so, as Stocky mentioned earlier, in order to really achieve the highest level of Clovis culture, you had to know where the precious rocks were at. And so you had to have a whole network of knowledge come together for Clovis culture to even exist. Not just the process of making those tools, but identifying the rocks in the local area that could be used for those purposes. And how long did it take for all that to happen? The pace at which knowledge was gained, acquired, and then immediately put into use and then passed into generational reproduction, to me is mind-boggling. And I would just like to see, what an average day was like. How different were they? Like Dwayne said, how much are we really like these people? I mean, these people shared space with saber-toothed tigers, and they hunted the most dangerous animal in the world, an 11,000-pound animal that could run 35 miles an hour. The stuff that they endured, the short-faced bears that they had to stare down, the incredible drops in temperature that just must have been absolutely merciless. The cold days on end where there's no water that's not frozen. How do you keep water thawed? I understand you live by the river, but still, it was cold. I just cannot, in my mind, imagine how tough these people were. And, what would they think of us? Where we kind of eat the same thing day in and day out. We live in the same climate day in and day out, no matter what it is outside. Our problems are all psychological and stuff that we do to ourselves, not nearly the kind of existential threats that these people faced. So, I could go on obviously all day on that, but, back in 2013, when I first got involved with this, and I want to segue just a moment, and was working with my good friends, Crystal and Marcia, and we decided that we wanted to do a film on this. And, obviously we didn't get around to it, and I think it's still on the to-do list. But as part of the inspirational piece, our good friend Marcia wrote this beautiful poem here. And I just want to share it. And it's a poem for the Anzac boy. And so if we could just kind of maybe close our eyes for a moment and let me read this to everyone. The Mammoth Hunter. My brothers and I have seen the brightness of the sun turn to the shadow of the moon too many times. Our women have birthed more death than life. How long before we cannot feed ourselves? What will become of us? We prayed to the stars for you, my son. When your brothers died before coming, we prayed to the stars for you. And when you came from your mother, I held you up and told the stars, he will be a great hunter. He is the future of my people. Look, my son, my beautiful boy, I have made you a knife for hunting mammoth. I carried the rock from the quarries of the south. I sharpened the blade for you. I asked the stars to bless it for you. One day I will teach you to hunt mammoth. One day you will feel the blood boil in your veins and smell the beasts on the wind. A mammoth will feed us for many moons. A mammoth will clothe us, protect us, and save us for many moons. We cannot take a mammoth without you now. You are our future, our hope. One day, with you by my side, I will once again feel what it means to be a man and kill a mammoth. I will make you tools for this day. My brothers and I will make you tools of every size and color, the sacred tools of our people. One day I will teach you to make the tools, to sharpen, to hone, to bless them under the stars. These tools will take life and give life. Without them, we can't survive. Our lives are at the mercy of the earthly chaos. Storms and winds appear in the sky. Heat and cold arise at will. Beasts as big as mountains, birds with sharpened talons. We must always find safety and shelter. We find peace and order in the sky, the rising and setting of the sun, the moon in her ever-changing dress. The stars reveal nightly signs that guide us to our destiny. The sky is constant, its order blesses us. And now the chaos of the earth has chosen to take you from us. My grieving heart will not cease and will follow me to my end. You will never become the hunter I dreamed. The sacred tools we have made for you will never bring down a mammoth for us. We leave you here, sheltered from the winds and passing beasts, beneath a star to guide your way. We leave you to the sacred tools to take with you on your journey. I give them to you, blessed with earth's blood and with the Father's broken heart. Forever you will lay here at the crossing of the rivers. Beyond this life, my soul will follow this star to find you here. And then we will feel the blood boil in our veins and smell the beast on the wind. We will gather the sacred tools, and together we will hunt mammoth. Together we will feel what it means to be a man. And so that was Marcia Fulton. Beautiful poem. February 2nd, 2014 is when she dedicated that. And, I think just very powerful imaging, very powerful images there, and words that reflect what Dwayne was saying about, just all of the emotion, all of the love that was in this burial. And if I could just follow up with one last thing on that too, on that point, the burial is so mysterious to me because, and the other burial, because not only is it the only Clovis burial, but that I know of, Native people in Montana did not bury their loved ones. They were all scaffold burials. There's many reasons why there were scaffold burials. It's very hard to dig in the earth, had no shovels. Typically it's rocky and hard in Montana. And of course, during winter, when most people die, the ground is frozen. And so, the idea of digging into the earth at that stage just didn't make a lot of sense. And so just the idea that this boy was buried is such an anomaly, I think, for the region. And then again, the other one that was buried along with him, and that site, a lot of times burial sites in Montana, what we'll find them is up the riverbanks, because as I mentioned, people typically die in the winter, and then they'll scaffold bury them up above the river, high up above on the ridgeline. But this doesn't have those qualities about it. I mean, there's a hillside there, but there's really not a ridgeline to speak of. And so I think the whole thing is just so mysterious.
Thank you, Shane. Another question came in about burial sites. What is the potential of finding other, maybe even older burial sites in the county? There are a number of prominent features throughout the Shields and Paradise Valleys. And the person asking the question is wondering whether any other research is going on, if any of you know of other research.
Karen, I guess I would say that in regards to research and burial sites, burial sites are certainly not something that would be on the list of exploring for. And I'm sure some of our other members here would can elaborate on more thoroughly, but I think the opportunity, the fact is, it's very likely this is not the only Clovis burial in the world, but for reasons of respect and empathy, it would not be characteristic of me, for instance, to go searching or exploring for that. And I don't know of anyone who's looking for burials, and I'm guessing that my opinion is probably similar to those to the other folks on the board as well.
Thank you.
There was a question about the quarry for the stone tools in the cache. Has that quarry been identified? And if so, how far away, or quarries, how far away were they?
That is a great question. I'll jump in here again. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt anyone. We really don't know because of the nature of some of these cryptocrystalline rocks that are used, such as cherts. It's very hard. They're not like obsidian that you can just do an analysis on and go to a specific location. And you can do that with obsidian. However, the chemical makeup of most cherts and different silicates like that are so generic that it's hard to specifically focus on one. It's hard to find exactly what quarry they might be from. Now, visually, and in those respects, I think that it's possible to maybe come close, but it's chemically right now. Now, technology, you know how that goes. It changes. A good thesis to look up would be the Scott Jones thesis regarding the materials. He did a pretty good and awesome study years ago on the Anzick site as well. So I don't have the direct link to that, but he did a lot of work on specifically the materials and the artifacts and did a very, very good job. But yes, right now, I have some thoughts on that, but I haven't been able to put full research into it.
Okay, fair enough.
What do you think, Stocky?
I think there's probably some sites that are up possibly out of Lewistown. And as we know, there might be some locations, and I'm not naming them obviously because I don't want to take the chance of people going places. There's some places in Gallatin Valley that I believe might be similar to some of the materials. And the tabular chert, like the big artifacts were made of, I think that there was a lot of, there are quite a few similar locations. It's just so hard to know for sure. There could have been small outcroppings that were specific to that grouping of pieces that were taken at a particular time. I'm always looking. So it's like that one important characteristic of the artifacts is that there was no obsidian, and that's huge. It's only, 60 miles north of Yellowstone Park. So, and there was also no quartzite, which is another, quartzite's been used for, gosh, we've found all kinds of quartzite artifacts to, we'll say, 8,000 years ago at least. And those materials, these people were looking for specific materials. And I'm not sure, Shane, where I would start with that, except it would take some real close scrutiny regarding the specific pieces. We've looked at these pieces, my wife and I, separately and in groups. And although it's been mentioned there might be 5 to 7, I think there might be fewer than that, because if you look at a few of these individually, they look different. However, if you look at them as a group, they, the dendritic seams or lines that run through some of it, the process of actually looking at the whole group can change the color, gradually changes, and it represents, I think, fewer locations than we have previously thought. That's just my ideas. I could be wrong, but visually that is how it appears. So maybe 3 or 4 as opposed to 6 or 7. So my answer is I don't know for sure.
I get you. I think the chert mine over here is kind of young, over in the Three Forks, only 3,000 years old. I guess one of the questions I'd have is that, do we have traces of Yellowstone obsidian from 12,600 years ago? If we did, then I think we'd have a major conundrum there. If people were already mining that stuff back then, why wasn't it in this grave? But on the other hand, maybe the tools used for killing woolly mammoth, chert was perfectly good. It was just as good as obsidian, and it was easier to find and closer by. And so they didn't feel the need to go all the way down to get the obsidian.
We do know that.
Oh, go ahead.
We do know that Clovis did use obsidian. There was at least one obsidian artifact found in the excavation. I believe it was from a fellow by the name of Otto Mack in Gardner, Montana. And also during one of the archaeological surveys I was involved in the south part of Yellowstone Lake years ago, one of my colleagues found a base to an obsidian point as well. So we know that they did use a Clovis obsidian point, that is. We know that they were using that for whatever reason. That particular assemblage that was, now they might have used obsidian in that group, it just wasn't reflected in that particular assemblage.
There's another question, and hopefully this is something that you can respond to. And the question is, why does the cascade point show ethnicity? Doesn't make sense. And I'm not sure if that question is something that.
Cascade, as I recall, is an more focused in the area of, I want to say Oregon. I'm not a specialist on Cascade. It seems to me they're a foliate point. They basically have 2 points, I guess you could say, one being the working end and the other being at the proximal end. So proximal being foliate, more rounded but pointed, and then the working end, the distal end would be more of a projectile point, I suppose. I don't know. It seems to me that was around the 10,000 year ago as well. Maybe could have been contemporary. How that is or isn't culturally diagnostic, I'm not sure. It's a good question, and I don't know how it would work in with Clovis culture so much, but always great points of learning the differences and similarities between cultures temporally and spatially is very important across the board. So great question.
Let's see, here is another question. The person says, brings up another question. What did they use for shelter? And he's added the word year. I'm not sure what he means by that. Use for shelter year. If such large animals existed, then wigwams, stick shelters were not suitable. What would work for warmth, protection, and security? Anyone want to?
Do you guys mind if I keep blabbing? I think I can add to that. I guess I would think that a good possibility is a semi-subterranean, meaning partially buried in the soils. I know that there has been Upward Sun River site in Alaska is one that is contemporaneous. Basically, it's a little bit later than Clovis, but it might represent some similar habitation. And that actually, those were also burial locations, and they were semi-subterranean places, houses. And I would suppose that people who were as intelligent and sensible regarding their survival and how to survive in the land, I think that they would understand the insulating qualities of soils and incorporate that into their living spaces. And I'm guessing that that is a good possibility. Again, just my thoughts based on some contemporaneous or closely contemporaneous structures that have been found.
And I'd just like to throw out too that, we need to do some more collaboration with archaeologists in Russia and Siberia. There have been sites found where they think they've found some of these semi-subterranean structures and stuff like that. And so I think that's an area that definitely needs to be explored. We can't just isolate Clovis and North America. We need to look at the broader picture of people at this time in this environment.
So there's a question, if other artifacts were found farther east in Montana, what would that say about their migration or area Clovis roamed? What would it say about future study?
You guys are going to get sick of hearing from me.
This is your wheelhouse.
Okay. I honestly, that's one of the great questions. I think that every time we find more tools or sites, no matter what culture it is, it tells us more about the movements of peoples and their use of materials, and there might be similarities, close similarities between one place to the other that might suggest trade networks. And I think that we can pretty well, I certainly feel that even back in Clovis days, there were trade networks. There must have been. These people stayed alive because of their collaboration with their other people. They weren't, this was an egalitarian based grouping and society, I guess you could say, culture, because in order to survive in those harsh times, they had to work together. And I think that the more things are found and properly documented, we're going to find out more about the people who lived in those days and other cultures, how those cultures developed into later cultures, and it all comes into play. And the more we know, the more we know. So it's, I think it's a continual process of learning, and that's why understanding places like the Anzick Site and anywhere that is found and any materials that are found, the data just keeps adding up, and those data can be used to establish our understanding of the past. And then we know that these people were, I mean, they were super intelligent. There is no way I could survive back then. I mean, it's amazing to me. And these people were, I think, having the general public understand that they were people of high intelligence, and they weren't cavemen. They were people like us. They were people who were, the difference, one of the huge differences was that they understood so much about the environment and how to survive. It just speaks volumes, and so much, like Shane has said, that I will never understand, and I'm just always in awe thinking of the days they must have spent. So yes, the more we find culturally, the more we find artifact wise, the more we'll know.
I also want to emphasize that, Stocky, what you touched on with the socialization. I think there's been, suggestion that that really is what made our species survive, whereas Neanderthals, for example, didn't have those social skills, apparently. And so they didn't last. And so I think that's what makes, us as human beings, that social networking that existed that far back, I think it's really, really cool to think about that existed then too, and existed probably even beyond that, maybe even 50,000, 100,000 years ago. And it's really important today. And so it's something that we all share as part of our humanity.
I want to ask the panelists if any of you have questions for each other.
I do. And I'm hoping maybe Reed and Shane, and actually I've talked to Shane about this quite a bit. I'm really interested in trying to visit tribal communities, the younger generation, and talk to them about how cool science is. And actually I had participated in National DNA Day and went to Blackfeet Reservation a long time ago. It was in the early 2000s. In fact, Sky and I talked about that maybe our paths crossed. And so I'm just trying to figure out, are there opportunities for me to try to reach out to Native communities and visit people? I'm really interested in engaging with the younger generation. So any thoughts on that?
Absolutely, I think so. Not to step in, Dwayne, but just, I think, Sarah, there's a lot of potential to collaborate with tribal colleges and the high schools in the region, so the tribal colleges could maybe host an event and the high school students could come and attend, or, you could visit both, the high school and the tribal college. But I think combining those two, the higher ed and the public school system together, I think you get a broader group of folks, and I think that it becomes more of a topic for conversation. And I think that's how, you open up the doors for potential scholars to emerge, for new ways of thinking about research, for new ways of doing research. What do you think, Dwayne?
I think there's plenty of opportunities to interact and get to know Indigenous people in Montana. I know with my tribe, we have multiple cultural events that anyone's welcome to go to. We generally, as a historic preservation officer, I like to get any chance that I can to be able to address our population. So, because oftentimes we need to gather information from them. We need to let them know what's going on in the tribe, projects that might affect them. We love to get together as a people. We just recently had a round ends. During those times, it's great to get to know the people. We also use these opportunities to gather information. Also, I know Salish Kootenai College, I have a number of colleagues there in their preservation program that would love to have a person like you come and speak to the students. I think it's very important for Indigenous people to learn to be in the fields of anthropology and archaeology, especially the science and the technology. The one of our former councilmen, he's married to the president of SKC, and he's a close friend of mine, Dr. Boham. And I'm sure I could help you make arrangements for that. And if we stayed in contact in the future, there would probably be plenty of opportunities to interact with my tribe and bring them that information. That's something that we really strive to do, and that we think is really, really important. So we'd love to have you come by sometime, and it's usually really fun, a lot of fun, a lot of food, and you never know who you'll meet. One time I was tapped on the shoulder, turned around, and it's, oh my gosh, it's Denise Juno, and I was just like, ah, so you never know who you're gonna meet there. So yeah, we welcome people to come and interact with us, and get to know us as a community. We're a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Yep, I really can't echo Dwayne's comments enough. It's so true. I think that as you were saying, Sarah, younger people, they perceive and think of science a little differently. And I think that, catching them while they're young and showing them the opportunities that are available to them will make a big difference in the future generations. And you just, for myself, I kind of wonder, if we had been trying to make these inroads, a couple decades ago, if we would be that much further along. But everything it comes in its own due time, I think.
Any other questions you'd like to ask of each other before I wrap things up?
I have a question for Sarah that I've wanted to ask her for many years since I did my capstone research into the Clovis Child. In your own words, what prompted you to go ahead, even though you weren't legally bound to have to do any type of consultation or reburial? What was it about this that made you make those choices, which I found was like so wonderful? Like Shane was saying, it's great to see people come together this way, because the other one, Kennewick, man, the scientists and the tribes, they ended up in a really bad legal battle, and this wasn't the case, and you didn't have to do anything that you did. And I just always wondered, what was it about this site and these remains that prompted you to go ahead and do tribal consultation and go through a reburial process with the tribes?
Thank you for that question, Dwayne. Yeah, so it was definitely, as you can imagine, a lot of kind of like the weight of the world on my shoulders through the whole process. And I had consulted with tribal members before the work was done. And so I did have various inputs of, thoughts on that. And I also went to the burial board with Shane. And I remember one tribal elder said, absolutely, you should not rebury, because you're reburying our past and that's all we have.
I
And
remember that.
And so it was a really difficult decision, but the decision became very clear to me when I think the overwhelming majority of tribes that Eska and Shane had visited wished that we would rebury. And for me, it meant final closure, and it meant this child had given us a gift, and now was a time for me to, our family to return something and return that child to the earth where his parents put him for his final resting point. And so it just felt right, and it felt that that's what needed to be done. I will tell you that I had, scientists say, what are you doing? These are some of the most important remains that ever exist. But I felt like, well, we've learned already, he's already given so much. And so now it's time to give back. And that's really what it boils down to. And it feels amazing. It really does. I just feel really fortunate to have the tribal ceremony, and so many people attended. It was more touching than I would have ever imagined. And so it's very special, and I have absolutely no regrets. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, that answered my question, and
That was
I
worth the
have to
whole
give
thing.
it to you. I mean, the only remains with Clovis, it's very, very unique. And yeah, that was this part of the story that just stood out to me so much. You know, you weren't legally bound. And I mean, the rarity of these remains is, you know, like I said, it's the only human remains associated with Clovis. And to see you, you know, not only do the reburial, but to put in that work to go around to all the tribes and, you know, see how they felt. For me, that's what stood out about the case, you know, the most. And so I just always wanted to ask you that, you know, what was it? So thanks for answering my question.
It's a great story, and it's for the ages now, you know, and people will look back and say, wow, you know, that was something to learn from. That was something to try and, you know, model. And I'm just so proud and thankful to be Sarah's friend and to be a part of this whole thing. What a wonderful gift that we're all still receiving blessings from how many years later. And, you know, it's our story, it's our home, it's our backyard, all of us. I'm just so thankful. And, you know, again, you know, just like so many other places in Montana, we want to protect it. We want to make sure that, you know, it's not threatened. And, you know, that's something for future generations to maintain, but we're doing the best we can right now.
And I've always hoped that the Anzick Site serves as a model, and I really do feel that it's opened up communication, and where there is more communication between the scientists and native communities, and I've already seen it, and I'm really excited about it because I like to think that the Anzick Site did kind of initiate a little bit more openness, and I hope that continues. Those communications and friendships and bonds continue. Because it's so important.
Me too. Oh, you're muted, Karen.
Yep. Thank you, everyone. It's very difficult to put an end to this conversation. It has been a delightful evening, and the Yellowstone Gateway Museum and myself would like to thank all of you for participating in the speaker series, and for you, the audience, for tuning in, and for those of you who tune in via YouTube once we have this program uploaded. I am just kind of blown away by all of the wonderful things that all of you have shared, your love for the site, what it's meant to you as far as your careers, and just thank you. Thank you so much for participating. If any of our audience members have questions that didn't quite get answered, you are welcome to contact me at the Yellowstone Gateway Museum, and I'll put you in touch with some of these awesome experts. So thank you. Have a wonderful night. And until next time, good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good to
See
see
you
everyone.
guys.
Have a good night.
Take care, everybody.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.